other matters now, but and so we're all aware his session will be recorded. So if you do not wish to be visible, please turn off your camera. So, Father George.
Thank you. It's hello. It's very nice to be with you all. Hope you can hear me okay. Now, I'm going to try and say something about my own monastic experience, but I want to start in a very different place. We're in a ballroom in the 1950s on a Friday evening. Victor Sylvester's band strikes up and couples start to glide around the room, generally looking beyond each other. One thing is certain, they're not looking at their feet. Without looking to check, they nimbly step around each other with a wonderful deftness. Some talk quietly as they dance or just enjoy it all vacantly. Are they thinking all this time, now I put my right foot here, now I put my left foot there, now we turn, and now he puts his foot there? Surely not. The dancing is not being done by their brains. It's being taken care of by the feet and the legs. When these nice people were learning the steps, they had to use their brains, of course. But gradually a point came where the brain could largely be done without. Muscular memory takes over and the brain can get on with other things. Affectionate conversation, anxious thoughts about the shopping, the need to find another job, while the feet deftly dance away. To think about each step and bodily movement as you do it would cause you to stumble or to tread on your partner's toes. It's the same with touch typing, playing the piano, and many other skills in life. And you'll know this from playing the piano if that's what you do. The mind has to get out of the way and let the body do the running. Thinking is quite likely to cause you to stumble. In recent years, research has revealed the many ways in which judging, deciding, and acting originate more from the physical body than from the mind. Often the brain seems to be left completely out of the picture. In body language, for instance, we can betray our inner state quite unawares. The obsessive swinging of a foot, the uneasy look of our eyes. As I sit writing at my desk, someone might knock on the door. I bid them come in and greet them with a smile. And I feel my deliberate smile makes them feel very welcome and relaxed. But in my face, they can see the traces of irritation, and I can't see it. Our bodies send out more information than we realize. In one psychological study, thinking about the future caused participants to lean slightly forwards, while thinking about the past caused them to lean slightly backwards. In one study, participants holding warm cups of coffee were more likely to judge someone trustworthy than those who were holding cups of cold coffee. Physical illness can cause depression. Depression can be a source of physical illness. People who are happy tend to stand tall and perky, while sadness can make us droop. We're rediscovering the myriad ways in which our minds and bodies are interconnected. We used to think of the mind as a superior part of our being, the seat of our thinking, deciding, assessing emotions, and so on, while the body belongs to a lower level, dealing with practical necessities under the command of the mind. But it's not quite so. It's becoming ever more evident. Then there's a third aspect of this, which is to do with our unconscious mind. If you look at the variety of objects around your room, you take in an experience that is, in fact, immeasurable, infinite, and full of unseen depths. We're so habituated that we are routinely unaware of this extraordinary richness in which we are swimming. And one person who blazed a trail in this journey was Maurice Merlo Ponti, the French philosopher who died in 1961. He says that what we encounter in people and things is the surface of an inexhaustible depth. We have many layers within us, strata, receding further and further below our sight. There is a tacit world inside us, which is always alive, but we're unaware of it, and it only bubbles up when prodded. A lot of that tacitness resides in our fingers, our feet, our gut. Not long ago, I read a very interesting book on the gut. Some of you might have come across it, in which the author showed that some of our decision-making and responses to things originate in the gut rather than the brain. Our minds and physical bodies and the world are intricately intertwined. Now, all of this has implications for the Christian life. One thing I've been becoming increasingly aware of over my almost 40 years in monastic life is something that's a bit surprising. You think of monastic life as an interior journey in the life of contemplation. Indeed it is. But I've become more and more aware of the objectivity of the life. It's a life rich in practices, apparently religious ones. I say apparently because it all overlaps, all mixed up with the practical. Now, my community, there we are. And if ever you want to watch our streamed services, we stream everything. Obviously, in our monastic life, worship is at the heart, worshipping in the church several times a day, but also washing up for many people, praying on your own, living in community, wearing a habit, staying in one place without coming and going as you want, learning how to get on with people who can be difficult or uncongenial, looking after many guests, running finances, once a week confessing our failings to one another, practicing obedience, and so on and so on. I sat down not long ago to try and make a list, and it's huge. And there are still things missing from the list. Monastic life is a cornucopia of practices of every kind in which each of us is honed, tuned, brought up against God and brought up against humanity and against ourselves. And in short, over many years, we're gradually changed by these activities in a process that largely goes on in our hidden layers. I'm very conscious of having, at this stage in my life, of having been formed by so much of it, this objective external practice. Now, Here's an illustration. You might know the dictionary, the new dictionary of liturgy and worship. And the cover designer, they never ask the authors, publishers never ask authors what they want in their cover. The designer assumed that prayer and worship is about this. An individual, eyes closed, hands together, and so on. Now, all of that, of course, private prayer and meditation are an important part of monastic life, but they're not the only part. Over the last 30 years or more, researchers have been exploring this bodiliness, this outward practice, the connection of the physical world with things deep down within us. I've found that my monastic experience is confirmed in a lot of this research, and it's made me increasingly aware of how the modern paradigm of the individual making a personal interior journey of faith and developing a personal relationship with the Creator can be pretty misleading in the way it's understood and lived out. The term often used in the scholarly world for what I'm talking about, the most commonly used term is embodied cognition. And you can Google it and find quite a lot of stuff on it, embodied cognition. Cognition is always to some degree embodied, enacted by the body, or inextricably enacted from the body. This goes against all our presuppositions. The 17th century philosopher René Descartes, as you will know, has had a big influence here. He believed the essence of me was my mind. And so his famous dictum, I think, therefore I am, is paradigmatic of so much in the contemporary Western mindset. For him, thinking is all we need to lead us eventually to all truth. I am a mind, and this mind is carried around in a body. This, see if I can find it. The Economist, oh, it's not there. How funny. Sorry, my illustration isn't there, but oh, here we go. What about this? Never mind. In The Economist a few weeks ago, there was an illustration of a huge robot. And this robot, it was as tall as a house. But instead of the head, there was a driver's cab with a man in it. And the man was driving the robot. And this was really neatly illustrates Descartes' understanding of the place of the mind. Where he was mistaken, we can see what Descartes is getting at. The body would hardly be up to much without a mind in it, would it? But where he was mistaken was to think you can separate the two and put them in completely different categories. And from him stems the fatal dualism in the Western understanding of our humanity, a belief that the mind and the body are two completely distinct realities. Descartes would be a bit thrown by embodied cognition and all that's being revealed about it. The relationship between body and mind is so complexly interwoven that instead of I think, therefore I am, we'd need to say something like, I live with the whole of myself, body and mind, and therefore I am. For Descartes, more follows. The mind can stand apart from the world and analyze it. He's one of the initiators of what we call the age of reason, the Enlightenment. Reason is the source of all truth. All we need to use is our brains. The world and life are an object over there. The mind can analyze the world and so can understand. Many theologians think they can do the same with God. God is treated as an object over there, which I can analyze. The age of reason has, of course, produced stupendous achievements, perhaps the greatest being science, as we call it. Almost miraculous advances stemming from this science have left us with an assumption that reason can, in the end, sort everything out. Trust the science, as the catchphrase is at the moment. Our mind, according to this view of science, can stand apart from the body and from life and penetrate the secrets of the universe. However, we instinctively concentrate on science's successes, but the failures, of course, are huge. The Soviet Union rejected God and enthroned reason and became a source of untold human suffering. The atom bomb was a scientific triumph, but leaves us with consequences we have no idea how to deal with. Science can be very slow and uncertain on how to cope with things it has produced so quickly. The competence of reason and science is narrower than Descartes thought it was. And secondly, you will no doubt also have come across this, that our exalting of reason and science presumes science can stand apart and observe. But the scientific world is now realizing there's no such thing as an impartial observer. The scientist cannot perform an experiment without influencing it. No one can stand outside of the world as a disembodied mind and be an impartial spectator. If our mind is unable to improve the world without serious loss, how then do we gain the fullest understanding of life? Going back to Merlo Ponti, he says that we need to throw ourselves into the hurly-burly of the physical creation. The development of our reasoning faculty has been a wonderful gift, but we've made the mistake of enthroning it, rather than assigning it its proper place on the ladder. He says we are not simply brains in bodies, we are all intertwined with the world around us. If you take the example of listening to music, you could say, well, it's all going on in my mind. But it would not be there without the physical sounds, the bodies, the instruments, the performers, or without my ears. Many, many things are intertwining with us continually. And we can say this about the whole of our life. For Christians, there are consequences of all of this. The love affair with reason, for a start, over the last few centuries, has gone hand in hand with the development of similar views in the spiritual life. There is for us a great emphasis, as I've said, on the personal interior relationship with God. The personal pilgrimage of each individual in this private relationship. But this notion of the centrality of personal faith is very recent. It was in the latter part of the 17th century that people suddenly started developing a new sense of interiority that had far-reaching implications for religion, leading to a growing emphasis on interior, subjective aspects of religion. We've lived through 2 or 3 centuries in this climate, and what it's left us with is some deep assumptions that we don't think to question. I'm sure this is one reason why many people today struggle with prayer and struggle with faith. We assume that the heart of being Christian is that each of us should have a living personal relationship with God, and that prayer should first of all be a personal journey in that relationship, pursued with our minds. In some ways, this is an advance. The emphasis on personal relationship has developed hand in hand with our gradual growth in the capacity for self-reflection. We're self-reflective people today to a degree that was not at all so common in the 17th century. And when this is pursued in the right way, it is a huge advance for human beings to be more self-reflective. There have been great gains here in what it is to be followers of Christ. But this personal understanding of following Christ has been distorted by being enthroned rather than finding its proper place on the ladder. Here I turn to George Lindbeck, an American Lutheran theologian working in the second half of the 20th century. He takes doctrine as an example. For him, Christian doctrine has gone through 3 stages. Now, what a nuisance. My picture isn't there again. Let's do this. Just a minute. Nope, not that one. Sorry, it's this one. Can you see that? No, you can't. It's not on my... well, all I was doing with that was now what have I done? I seem to have lost. I'll just carry on as I am. I seem to have lost your, oh no, I haven't, there we go. Terribly sorry about that. The technology has failed me, but I was only going to put the terminology up to help with it. For Lindbeck, Christian doctrine has gone through 3 stages. Before modern times, the approach to it was propositional. Doctrine gives us propositions which we have to accept. Not accepting them can be dangerous, as many an unfortunate soul burning at the stake in the Middle Ages will have reflected. Nowadays, the propositional approach to faith is instinctively sidelined by the majority of people. Modern people don't like teachings and doctrine. They've tended to be replaced by what Lindbeck calls the next stage, the experiential, expressive approach. I quote him, "Modernity presses individuals to meet God first in the depths of the soul, and then perhaps to join a church if they find something congenial about it. For us today, I'm quoting again, communal and public traditions are optional aids in individual self-realization. It's now not the church and its teachings and life, but me and my spiritual journey. There's little question of it being intertwined with a culture, a tradition, a community. We plough our own furrow, starting from our own resources, and then picking and mixing amongst the external resources as far as they seem to help. In worship, even committed Christians can tend to look for a feel-good factor in it. We want to feel at that moment that we've got something out of it. This is, of course, a principle which is impossible to apply in normal human life, such as the family, work, or physical exercise. As an expectation, it is largely fantasy. For Lindbeck, this experiential approach, the quest for personal experience, bears within itself the seeds of its own exhaustion, because we are profoundly social beings. We depend on each other for our well-being. And not only that, one thing which distinguishes humans from the rest of creation is culture. Culture and language have enabled our extraordinary development. Human beings flourish when embedded in the living corporate culture, which is part of ourselves and largely outside ourselves. In his very influential book, The Nature of Doctrine, published in 1984, Lindbeck discerns this a third way emerging, which he calls cultural linguistic. He gives it that name because in this third way is how cultures and languages work. So cultural linguistic might seem a slightly surprising label, but he's wanting to look at how these things work, and is wanting to say that religion, if we want to use that word, really operates best when it's working like a language or a culture. The English language, for instance, is a vibrant living tradition going back thousands of years and changing all the time as it goes along. Although it's constantly changing, at any moment it is given, it's a given, and you have to give yourself to it, the English language. And the process of giving ourselves to it is transformative and life-giving. Our language, which originates from quite outside our brains, is the making of us. Without it, we wouldn't be able to express any profound thoughts or even think in any useful way. Language is inseparable from community. It's a corporate phenomenon. Growing into a language can only be achieved by practicing it. Study of it helps, but physical practice is primary. In the world of teaching English as a foreign language, which I did for a bit in Italy, the best teaching starts with getting people to speak before they study. You get them to use the language even before they have any understanding of it. Start with praxis. The cultural linguistic, in a sense, embraces both of the other two, the propositional and the experiential, but it's not identical with either. According to it, faith is like a language. It lives first in its corporate practices. In Lindbeck's words, first come the objectivities of the religion, its language, doctrines, liturgies, and modes of action. and it is through these that passions are shaped into various kinds of what is called religious experience. Again, he says, to become religious, no less than to become culturally or linguistically competent, is to interiorize a set of skills by practice and training. We sit under, as it were, the practices of the religion, and through that we gain intuitive skills. Excuse me, I just mute so I can cough. In a similar way to Merlo-Ponti's inclusion of the body in our cognitive life, Lindbeck speaks of the development of intuitive, non-self-conscious skills and nous. He says, interiorized skill, the skill of the saint, manifests itself in an ability to discriminate intuitively between what is authentic and inauthentic. Having been inwardly formed by a given tradition, by, for example, the mind of Christ, as Paul puts it, the saint has what Thomas Aquinas calls connatural knowledge in matters religious. Those are all his words. Practice gives us skills, and the skills lead us down into the depths. George Lindbeck may not have realized that his understanding of our relationship to doctrine is very monastic. In accepted thinking about the rule of St. Benedict, now let's see if this one is here. Yes, it is. A distinction is made between lex and regula. Lex is law, legality, legislation. Regula is a rule, something to measure yourself against, to check whether you're on the right sort of lines. If a monastic rule is lex, it has to be accepted propositionally. If it's understood as regula, it becomes more a means of estimating whether we are singing the same song. St. Benedict is famous for encouraging adaptation of the rules according to the circumstances. I call him the monk of the bendy rules. I heard something interesting on this theme from a former captain of a nuclear submarine. He said the training involved spending 6 months learning all the rules, all the standard practices. If you made a single mistake with them, you were out, and that was the end of your career. Then you were sent out into the high seas for a further 6 months, when you had to show you understood how to break the rules. Any slip up there and you are out, and that's the end of your career. The training was looking for the emergence of a skill, a nous, not a mindless following of lex. Something that was more than head stuff and greater than the rules, but which had been produced by good grounding in them. And it would correspond to the spiritual journey which I myself have experienced in monastic life, that begins with commonly established practices. The propositional approach and the experiential approach have both been transcended. And that is pure St. Benedict. His rule has never been lived literally since the day it was written. Circumstances change, culture changes, people change. And whether by design or unawares, the rule has always been treated as a gold standard, regular rather than lex. So our following of Christ finds its engine room not in personal experience and reflection, not in external norms either, but in a higher synthesis where our entire humanity swoops, as it were, body and soul and abstract thought and physical world, all dancing together. What might these things have to say to us today? An obituary of a well-known anthropologist a few years ago quoted him as saying, "Religions are not concerned with belief, but with practice." If we look at the conversion stories in the New Testament, we can be surprised by how few people ask, "What must I believe?" Certainly, there is no mention of the word personal. More often than not, they ask, "What must I do?" The findings of anthropologists are pretty clear that religion started with what people did. It moved on then to what they felt and ended up focusing on what they believed. In our history in the West, a past historical experience of a propositional approach has left us with an assumption that the doorway into faith is not in propositions and practices, but in being able to screw up within ourselves some kind of experience and an ability to believe. There have always been people who have come to faith through finding their ability to believe, of course, but they're the exception. We come to God through intercourse with God through the means God makes available to us, and these are corporate and cultural and practical. The articulation of beliefs follows from the lived experience, and so it is in the Gospels. It is the encounter with Jesus that is transformative, even merely touching the hem of his garment. I've subtitled my lecture, "The Spiritual Life as an Exterior Journey." And I'm now going to outline 4 key elements in that journey. And I think myself that Christians today need to be much more securely rooted in these 4 elements. The first is the church. As a member of the body of Christ, I'm never alone when I pray. I know I'm praying with millions of others on earth and in heaven. That unending prayer into which I step, as stepping onto an escalator, goes on perpetually, rooted in the loving communion between the Father and the Son. It's God at work, and only then is it me at work. And certainly it is never the alone talking to the alone. Charles Wesley wrote in his hymn, "Let Saints on Earth in Concert Sing," "For all the servants of our King in earth and heaven are one. One family we dwell in him, one church above beneath." From this corporate perspective, an interior journey is enabled. And so we begin to discover God at the heart of our being. The public life and practices of the church are like a piece of clothing the police put to the nose of a tracker dog. The dog then goes off to sniff out the burglar. Christians need to have been trained in the skills of the church, and these equip us to get stronger whiffs of God. We need, furthermore, to know the church. Many ordinary believers don't really know it. For instance, it's encouraging, and one of the things that encourages me in my faith is knowing examples of dedicated and joyful Christian living and service of others in many parts of the world. And they are human stories. And I think many believers don't know enough of the human stories. They provide us with icons holding us before us, inspiring examples of the church at work. That's only one example. But one essential practice then for Christians is not only to be conscious of being the church, but to know the church. Secondly, the tradition. With this, we're not talking about any old practices. We have many inherited practices that could have been different in many ways. And in fact, they are in different parts of the world, of course. The Orthodox have a lot of different practices from the Church of England or the Church, Scottish Episcopal churches. Our practices could have been different, and their particular form may not be categorically necessary, but they are what we've received, and they are a language like English. In a language, however enlightened or educated the culture, it's always difficult to make any significant changes in the grammar. Think of the problems we're having at the moment with finding new pronouns to deal with all the possible gender computations we can find in ourselves. So we can only fall back on the word they. Languages are so embedded in us that they are difficult to change. A language illustrates well how the Christian tradition operates. And just as in the English language, the tradition and its grammar have to be accepted as things that are given. Givens are regular. The tradition gives us a sense of being in a trajectory rather than a static point. It gives us a sense of the layeredness of the faith, a genetic sense, a sense of our position in time. One way of becoming more aware of the tradition is to learn about the historical development of worship. And here I'm getting onto one of my hobby sources. If we're looking for an example of Christians being unskilled, we should reflect that we can go to church for years and repeatedly do things without knowing why we do them and why these things are there. There is a woeful lack of teaching about worship, not least due to poor, if not abysmal, preparation of many, if not most clergy for the task. The church needs to become a Berlitz language school of its own tradition. And to be a church that is alive, we need to be vibrantly conscious of the church and being the church and of the tradition. Now for practices. I shall just have to fill my water mug. Excuse me. And we come here to the most challenging element in what I want to say. We need to find out, and the challenge isn't at all easy, how we can become practically strong again in our own way for our own time. Strong in the kind of acting and living which before modern times was common everywhere. In pre-modern societies, life was full of practices you simply did, both secular life and in secular life and the life of prayer. You might know Eamon Duffy's book, The Stripping of the Altars. It gives a good picture of it from the Middle Ages in Britain. We shouldn't be tempted, however, to try and resurrect a dead past. That isn't what I mean. The past has gone and can never return. What needs to emerge is something of the same nature, but it's bound to be pretty different from what has gone before. For a start, pluralism is here to stay. So any commitment to practices is not going to be like one unchangeable corpus, but more like an articulated grapevine holding together a wide range of difference of practice. The kind of practices I'm thinking of, you'll be wondering, what actually am I thinking of? Well, there's so much. I've just done a few examples. Simple and doable practices of common prayer and scripture reading, not least daily prayer. A serious commitment to the Eucharist and the sacraments. Teaching and mutual help on mutual obedience. You might find that a surprising one. But submitting ourselves one to another is a very important commendation to us from the epistles of St. Paul and really from Jesus himself. And in its strong form, you find it in monastic obedience. But in its weak form, you find it in many parish church councils where each person just wants to say what they think and they're going to be put out if someone else wins the argument. Imaginative use of the church building and special places and reverence for them and using them in the spiritual journey. Corporate commitment to being at the service of others. Obviously, without this, we're just talking about being churchy. And this isn't what we're about. We're about the whole Christian life. And Christian practices will include, this umbrella thing covers so many things. The promoting of music, singing, the imagination, the Christian arts, encouraging the development of popular practices and prayers, practices valuing God's creation and the environment. This is all outworking of the gospel, isn't it? Those are only just a few things I threw down. We could add plenty more. You hardly know where to start. There is so much. How can we arrive at a point where the baptized have sufficient faith in these practices simply to get on with them? For instance, getting on with daily prayer, saying psalms, or singing them, even better. It would be very countercultural. And so there is the question of plausibility. Peter Berger, I think it was in The Sacred Canopy, his book, Sacred Canopy, coined the term plausibility structures. Plausibility structures are our tacit common understanding of what is plausible. My theme does not appear highly plausible in our world. To get congregations to do lots of bowing and gestures and lighting of candles and doing this and doing that and just getting on with it, knowing that they're going to produce fruit. There's a plausibility hump to be got over. And so we come to my fourth key thing, which is engagement with our culture. Another term similar to Peter Berger's plausibility structures is social imaginary. A social imaginary consists of ways of behaving, values, narratives, what is generally perceived as common sense, all the things that are part of our common psychology, determining the way we do things and assess them. For the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, our social imaginary is made up of deep normative images, making possible a widely shared sense of legitimacy. It seems to me that what is perceived as plausible in our society, its social imaginary, is partly constructed on a foundation of ignorance, what is taken to be normal or common sense. If you look at religious communities, for instance, they're made up of modern people. There isn't an incompatibility between our rich cornucopia of practices and modernity, but rather a gulf based on ignorance, on not knowing. Another example would be many clergy who discipline themselves to say or sing the daily office, and plenty of laity have discovered the same thing as well in recent years. You don't have to be countercultural or outside our social imaginary to do these things, actually. The word ignorance in Italian simply means not knowing, without any judgment involved. Our problem is, to quite a considerable degree, to do with information people do not know. But also, the church is poorly known by people outside and inside, not just information, but the encounter that we saw in Jesus. This not knowing contributes to the fact that many people struggle with prayer or don't pray, and that includes clergy. The not knowing goes with a misunderstanding that prayer has to be a private effort. Christian prayer can never ultimately be private because we are one body. There's no such thing as private prayer ultimately for Christians. For people who say they can't pray, I encourage them to look outwards, not inwards, and to practice, to make use where they can of church buildings, Christian art and music, to study contemporary Christian thinking, to discover where the church is doing inspiring things, and so on. What might this say about mission? Is a lot of contemporary Christian mission aimed too much at the personal dimension? Perhaps we need rather to offer very practical training in Christian practices. In fact, the preparing of this lecture has made me wonder whether our community shouldn't in fact start doing exactly that, offering training in Christian practices. I bet there'd be quite a bit of take-up. A lecture that I attended last week, and David did as well, by an American Jesuit. He gave Luton Parish Church as one of his examples of practical mission. And in the photograph, there was the parish church choir, vested in beautiful blue cassocks and full surplices, processing and singing through a shopping mall to the great pleasure of onlookers who might well want to know more. I'm a member, I'm nearly finished now, you'll be relieved to hear, I am a member of a group engaged in ongoing discussions between believers and atheists. It includes what used to be the National Secular Society. It's now, what's it called? Humanists UK, and so on. And one thing that very much comes over in these discussions with atheists, and they're very fruitful discussions. I got a lot from it, and we have a very good relationship. What comes over is the atheist's very strong sense of having little to offer to people in comparison with the huge wealth of Christian art, music, and culture. So they feel they start very much on a back foot. So I've been trying to think of ways to help them, but that's another story. Finally, what can I say to someone who says they've lost their faith? Who says, I can no longer believe in God. It's somehow just faded away. What can I say? I would say that they probably needed to lose it. We all have a mental image of God when we turn to God, and it will always be, to quite a degree, off the mark. I would tell them to put that image aside and delve into the flesh and blood reality of the church that is before their eyes. The people, the worship, the scriptures, the practices of prayer, the gestures, the artifacts, the sacraments, the church buildings, Christian art and music, the service of our neighbor, the engagement in public life. Give yourself to them and see what happens. Thank you.
Well, George, thank you very much indeed for that moving and provoking meditation. I think perhaps better than a lecture, but it certainly was that too. I've got all sorts of questions and yeah, things that you've challenged me about, but I'll open up the floor. We've got about half an hour or so at our disposal. So I just invite people to...
Sorry, I've lost the sound. I don't know what's happened there.
Oh, right. We can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Right. Anybody? I think we can all see one another on the screen just about. So I invite people to comment or reflect or ask Father Guiver questions.
I suppose I have a question, so I might just kick
Harriet,
off if you don't
yes,
mind.
Please. Yeah, please do.
I'm really keen to look at this whole idea of getting to know our church more. And as somebody who's been through training in the priesthood fairly recently, I wondered, what do you think the implications of what you've been talking about have for the training and formation of people going into ordained ministry?
Well, for a start, in the area of worship, too many training institutions send out clergy almost completely unequipped for explaining worship to people in a way that is actually the truth. People lap it up, actually. When I go out to preach, which isn't very often, I usually try and take the chance to explain to people some things about the liturgy, and people always lap it up. It helps to know the historical background, where things have come from, all the various ramifications of these things. And I find it simply incredible that clergy, there are many institutions where there is no liturgy teaching, or, I mean, I could tell you about one institution where the students do nothing on the Eucharist at all in the liturgical. So that's one area. And another would be, I mean, the centrality of the daily office in the life of the parish, not just the clergy. It's not a clergy thing. And we need to be finding ways, and there are no easy answers, for people and clergy to know they are all praying together as part of the church. I keep doing experiments in parishes on that. Yeah, I think it's simply, I mean, part of it is taking an interest, isn't it? I mean, many things are dismissed, which are in fact profoundly fruitful, potentially. Yeah, that sort of thing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Jerry, I think you've got a question.
Yes, Father George, that was just absolutely tremendous, wonderful. My question was, again, it's linked to what Harriet was saying. With the formation of clerics, would it be more advantageous then to remove that person from the community that they live in and place within a monastic style community for a period of time to embed them within the ritual and the rites? Or is there a blend to be had? Can one train for priesthood in the community?
Right. Now, a bit like the submarine driver, when I studied music at Durham University, one thing you had to learn to do was to write a Bach chorale tune with its harmonies, something which would be completely useless because of musically poor. But through doing that, you're exiting from the normal musical creativity and going into an area where, in fact, you learn by trying to do it. And perhaps that's not a very good example, but I mean, I do believe, I'm bound to, aren't I, being at Mirfield, that priests and ministers of other sorts as well are launched for their lifetime in a world that is incredibly hostile and distant from what we're standing for. And you need to have strong reserves inside you. And I don't think really that it's, well, I do think that you do need to come apart and have a strong dose of the culture of the church. You've got your lifetime to get involved in the hurly-burly. It just stays with you for a lifetime. Once you've been to this place, you've simply got to know it, and it'll be with you always. Yes, I think that's, I do. I mean, the training on the job that goes on, I'm glad that there's some of it in the church, because obviously residential theological colleges always come, inevitably, they become a bit of a hothouse. That's the downside of it all.
I wonder whether you could reflect. I was at a meeting yesterday of largely clergy, reflecting on what the church has learnt from the last 18 months or so of the pandemic.
Yes.
When to a large extent church buildings have been closed and we haven't been able to, or we haven't been prepared to meet as communities or able to meet as communities. And how do you feel? I mean, I know that must have, to a large degree, isolated a place like Mirfield, where you haven't had guests, I imagine, and so on in the way that you normally would have. So, I mean, can you reflect on what the church might have done that was different, or what the church might possibly learn from its ministry during the last 18 months?
There are certainly quite a few things, aren't there, which I think we've learnt from this. It's a bit difficult to say what the church could have done better, not being saddled with that responsibility as a bishop or as a parish priest. I think a lot of people have tried very conscientiously to do their best. But what it has highlighted, hasn't it, is our need of each other. And with that, we started streaming straight away in a rather amateur way, but we stream all our 4 daily services all the time. And we've developed a community of people who write in, you know, on Facebook, their little messages. And they become, and I realize that for quite a lot of these people, it's given them people to say goodnight to, and people to share their experiences with in the context of worship. They become quite a little congregation of themselves, these people who follow us. And I do think that this streaming of services is such a good thing that we must continue with it for some people, but also the loss of the physical engagement. I mean, it's so clear, isn't it, that we need physical encounter and engagement. Not only in church, I mean, everybody has been sort of registering this. And another thing is community, isn't it? I wonder whether the experience is going to help society think a bit more about community. One priest who was on a course I led, in her parish, she said there was one street where everybody was so tied up in themselves that neighbours didn't know each other and so on. But a thing developed that when a funeral went by, all the households would come out and stand on the street because there were several deaths, one after another in this area. Things like that, people have been pushed together, and we've realized, I think, the degree of our nakedness when we are without others, without engagement with others. So the church needs to be trying to take these as guidelines, doesn't it? I mean, one thing for me all the time is this business of praying, that so many Christians struggle with prayer. And so often it's because you're isolated with little sense of us all participating in the great universal prayer, which goes up to the throne of God. And it's going on, and we can just let ourselves be carried. Yes.
Okay. Any other questions or comments or reflections? Was everybody so absorbed with what's said that they...
I wondered if, and I tried to be a bit provocative in the way I put some things. I wonder if any people had questions about what I had to say about our personal relationship with God.
Harriet.
I suppose for me, I've come from an eclectic kind of church where experience was a big emphasis at one point. And I think for me, when I was really struggling with faith, actually getting into the roots of the church and its history and its development was the thing that grounded me, because it showed me that this is not just something that is for me alone. This is something, I'm part of a much greater thing. And so I think that journey of faith led me to want to explore the very things that you've been describing, of wanting to know more about the church and the rich, deep history of faith that it holds. And I think there's maybe something of what you've talked about tonight that I think really meets a need for people to know that there's more to faith than a rather flimsy individual attempt to connect with God, that we're actually part of something much bigger and deeper.
I think it seems to me that there are two dimensions in worship. There's mission, what I call mission and covenant, and you need both.
Mm-hmm.
So the kind of worship you described, full of enthusiasm and seeking experience and so on, that's characteristic of Christian mission. You try and meet people where they are and engage their people's feelings and some experience and so on. One wouldn't want it not to be there, but then you move on to the dimension of covenant, where, as in marriage, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, you simply give yourself, and you stop bothering so much about what you're getting out of it at every particular moment. And even with within any act of worship, there are bits of both elements. So we all do things in our worship, have some nice music or something to warm the cockles of our heart, to give expression to our feelings. Yeah, and it's just when one gets enthroned at the expense of the other that it's a bit difficult.
I wonder whether you could just perhaps reflect a little bit more. I'm much taken with the kind of notion of religion as language, you know, the Lindbeck, going back to that. And I mean, one of the characteristics of language, I mean, we all speak English, we're all speaking English as a language, but we use actually many different kinds of language, so that, you know, for years when I was, you know, when my kids were growing up, as it were, there was a point at which I could hardly kind of understand what they were saying, because they were speaking a kind of language which was quite different from mine. You know, some of the language we use in church to some people is it's still English, beautiful English often, but quite remote from people. So that you know, there are many kinds of English that we adapt to quite readily in our lives, depending on where we are and who we're with. And whether, you know, that might tell us something too about the kind of adaptability of religion or Christianity. And sometimes we're perhaps a little bit inflexible in church.
Yes. Some of you may have come across the notion of enculturation. A lot has been written on that. And I mean, it's quite clear that through Christian history, the faith has always reflected the cultures in which it's been set, either consciously or unconsciously. I mean, the Eastern Orthodox claim that their worship has never changed. But if you go through the history, you find it never got stuck until it started being printed. It was always changing. And one thing about enculturation is that you've got two things. You've got the living culture in which you are set and the life that is around you, but you also have to be inducted into the culture of first century Palestine in order to, you know, relate well to the Gospels. And you need to be enculturated into the worlds of the Bible. And I think it's the same with the liturgy and Christian doctrine. And sometimes the looking for more accessible words in the liturgy can be mistaken, I think, because we need to accept it will have its own language. I think, for instance, the vocative. I mean, nobody says, oh, George, nowadays. Well, you might if I'd done something wrong or something. But in worship, you need the vocative to address God. And so you've got to learn that and get used to it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're sort of sadly drawing to the end of our time together. But I would like to thank you very, very warmly indeed I think we can just say George now. I mean, everybody seems to be, even
Yes.
through this medium, we've kind of feel that we all know you much better now.
Yes.
But we're grateful for the insights that you've given us. I must confess, personally, I'm looking forward enormously to spending a little bit of time at Mirfield later this year, and sort of living something of the wisdom you've been sharing with us. And so I'm very grateful indeed. And do remember us in your prayers as we continue here. And thank you very much indeed. Before we all go, I'd like to remind people that we have one more meeting this year. It's on Thursday, the 24th of June, which is less than a month and is actually Midsummer Day, rather alarmingly. Our speaker is Professor Oliver O'Donovan, who is, I think, known to some of you. He taught moral theology at both Edinburgh and Oxford. And he's going to be talking about the theology of safeguarding, which is quite an interesting and immediate subject. And that's a very deliberate title, the theology of safeguarding. So that's next month, Thursday, the 24th, and that will be our last meeting until September. Could I also do a plug that if anybody happens to be doing nothing at 2:30 tomorrow, and you go onto YouTube, we're launching the book of the Doctrine Committee, the Scottish Episcopal Church, Made in the Image of God, which I have a copy here, which is being published or launched tomorrow. If you go to YouTube and put in, I guess, Made in the Image of God, you'll probably find us. You'd be more than welcome to join us and hear a little bit about what the Doctrine Committee's been up to in the last couple of years. So once again, George, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Oh, could I just say,
yes,
thank you for inviting me. It's made me work on this, and it's part of a book I'm trying to produce on the relationship between monastic life and daily life, and because I think there's a lot to do. But can I also do a plug that we were on Songs of Praise on Sunday, and amongst panda bears and marathon runners, we do appear now and again. So you might like to look at that.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody.
Bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.